All right, today we're going to step into a kind of theological courtroom. The Apostle Paul is on the stand, making his case in the letter to the Romans. And in the other corner, you have a hypothetical objector who's about to cross-examine him with some of the absolute toughest questions you can imagine about God, justice, and human failure. So let's step inside and hear how this all plays out. So let me ask you this right from the get-go. What if everything you thought gave you a special status, your heritage, your identity, your traditions, was suddenly put on trial? That's the exact tension Paul creates, and it forces us to grapple with this really personal question. What if the one thing you're counting on most just isn't enough? So to set the stage here, Paul has just made this really radical argument. He's basically said that everyone, and he means everyone, no matter their background, is a sinner and is accountable to God. Now, you can imagine this immediately provokes a sharp and pretty logical objection from someone representing the Jewish perspective whose entire identity was built on having this special covenant relationship with God. And so the objector steps up and lays out the challenge. They say, hold on a second, Paul. If we're all in the same boat, then what was the point of all this? What possible advantage is there in being Jewish? What's the value of circumcision, the very sign of our covenant with God? And you have to admit, it's a fair question. It really demands an answer. And Paul doesn't even hesitate. He doesn't dismiss the question at all. His answer is immediate, and it's strong. The advantage is huge. But the number one privilege, the first and foremost benefit, was actually this profound responsibility. He says they were made stewards, caretakers, of the divine revelation itself, the actual words of God. So the privilege was very real, but it came as a sacred trust. But the objector is not done yet, not by a long shot. They take this idea of human responsibility and they twist it. They turn it into an attack on God's own character. And this is where the cross-examination gets really intense, focusing on the question of God's faithfulness. You see, the objector sees an opening here and presses the attack, shifting the argument. They say, okay, Paul, fine. You say we were entrusted with God's words. But what if some of us were unfaithful to that trust? Does our failure, our lack of faith, somehow cancel out God's faithfulness to his promises? Now, this is a brilliant and frankly a dangerous question. It suggests that human failure could actually defeat God. Paul's reply is one of the most powerful phrases he ever uses. By no means. Now, in the original Greek, it's me geneto, which is so much stronger than just no. It's more like, let it not be, or absolutely not, or don't even think it. It is a horrified, emphatic rejection of the entire idea. Paul uses this phrase to just slam the door shut on any line of reasoning he sees as completely and utterly wrong. So why such a strong, visceral rejection? Well, it's because the objector's whole argument rests on a flawed premise. For Paul, God's character is the fixed point in the universe. God is always true, always faithful. Humanity, on the other hand, we are often false, often unfaithful. So here's the crucial point. Our unfaithfulness doesn't diminish God's faithfulness one bit. In fact, it does the opposite. It actually puts it on full display. But the objector's twisted logic doesn't stop there. It's about to take an even more perilous turn, moving from questioning God's faithfulness to an outright challenge of his justice. So now the objector sets this really clever trap. They argue, listen, if our sin actually serves to demonstrate God's righteousness, making it shine brighter by comparison, then how can God possibly be just in punishing us for that sin? Paul is really careful here to point out that he's speaking in a human way. He's basically saying, I'm voicing this flawed, human-centered argument so that I can completely dismantle it. And what's Paul's response? You guessed it, he deploys his ultimate rebuttal, by no means. This repetition creates this powerful rhythm in the debate. For the second time, a dangerous idea that undermines the very character of God is met with this absolute, unwavering rejection. There is zero room for negotiation on this point. And Paul's reasoning here is just devastatingly simple. He points out that the objector's argument completely defeats itself. See, everyone involved in this debate, including the objector, believed that God is the judge of the entire world. But what is a judge? By definition, a judge must be just. If God were unjust, as the objection implies, the very foundation for his judgment would crumble. He couldn't judge anyone. The whole idea becomes meaningless.
And this all leads us to the final, most corrupt conclusion of the objector's entire argument. Paul shows how this kind of thinking doesn't just stay in the realm of theory. No, it spirals downward into a morally bankrupt philosophy for how to live your life.
And right here, we see the slippery slope in action. It starts with this seemingly clever idea, hey, my sin makes God look good. Okay, that then leads to the question, well, if I'm helping God's glory, why am I getting punished for it? And where does that end? It ends in this absolutely horrifying conclusion. Let's do evil so that good things can happen. It's a complete inversion of all morality, using the idea of God's grace as an excuse to sin. Paul is so quick and forceful in his response to this. He basically says, this is not my gospel, period. He calls it a slander, a malicious twisting of his message of grace, spread by people who either totally misunderstand him or are deliberately trying to make him look bad. He completely and totally disowns this twisted logic. So, after dismantling these objections one by one, Paul is ready to deliver his final summary. The debate is over. All the arguments have been heard, and now comes the verdict. So, what's the big takeaway from this intense courtroom drama? It's that certain truths about God are just unshakable. They've been successfully defended by Paul. God remains faithful even when we aren't. He remains true even when we're false. He is just, which means he must judge sin, and he is holy, which means he would never condone doing evil for a good outcome. Our sin cannot change his character. It's that simple. These are the bedrock principles that can withstand any cross-examination. And Paul wraps it all up with this final chilling verdict. For anyone who would dare to take the good news of God's grace and twist it into a license to do evil, their condemnation isn't even questionable. It is, in Paul's own words, just. And that's a powerful warning that leaves us all thinking, is God's grace a reason for overwhelming gratitude, or is it an excuse for apathy? Because as Paul shows us, the answer to that question has eternal consequences.